General Motors told 141,000 people not to sleep near their cars, not because of a rumor, not because of a design flaw they hadn't seen yet, because the batteries were catching fire, and General Motors had known about it. Their official guidance: do not park inside, do not charge overnight, park 50 feet from other vehicles. You spent $37,000 on a car, and the manufacturer told you to keep it away from your house. This is the story of the Chevrolet Bolt, General Motors' electric future, its battery supplier's manufacturing defect, and the recall that took 2 years, 3 attempts, and $1.8 billion to actually fix the problem. They knew. They hid it behind a software patch, and the cars kept burning. Here's the question. This investigation will answer. General Motors issued 3 separate recall actions over the course of a year. Each one claimed to fix the problem. Each time, the fires continued. But the real question was not whether the cars were catching fire. The question was simpler. When GM chose the first fix, did they already know it was not enough? But why? The answer is in the documents, the timeline, and in what General Motors chose to do and not do at every decision point between November 2020 and August 2021. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand what the Bolt was supposed to be. 2017, Tesla had just announced the Model 3 at $35,000 and couldn't deliver it. General Motors walked into that gap. The Chevrolet Bolt EV, $37,495, 238 miles of range, 0 emissions. Available at Chevy dealerships across America, no waiting list, no reservation, no deposit. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year for 2017. Green Car Reports called it Best Car to Buy. General Motors CEO Mary Barra positioned the Bolt as proof that the old Detroit could compete with Silicon Valley. The Bolt used battery cells manufactured by LG Chem, a South Korean chemical company that had become one of the world's largest EV battery suppliers. The cells were made in South Korea and later at an LG facility in Holland, Michigan. By August 2021, General Motors had sold roughly 141,000 Bolts across model years 2017 through 2022. Every single one would be recalled. The reason was hiding in something smaller than a fingernail. The problem was in the battery cells themselves, 2 separate manufacturing defects. First, a torn anode tab, a structural component inside each cell. Second, a folded separator, the membrane that prevents the positive and negative electrodes from touching. Either defect alone was a quality control failure. Both defects in the same cell created the conditions for an internal short circuit. When the battery was charged to a full or near full state, the heat generated by that short circuit could trigger thermal runaway. Thermal runaway is not a fire in the conventional sense. It is a chain reaction. One cell overheats, ignites the next, then the next. It cannot be extinguished with water. It generates its own oxygen. It will burn until there is nothing left to burn. These defects were not caused by how owners drove or charged the vehicles. They were built into the cells at the factory. In November 2020, after 5 confirmed fires, General Motors issued its first recall, 50,932 vehicles, model years 2017 and 2018, and certain 2019 models with South Korean manufactured batteries. The remedy, a software update. The HPCM2 module, the hybrid propulsion control module, was reprogrammed to limit maximum charge to 94% of battery capacity. The logic was straightforward. Lower state of charge, lower risk of thermal runaway. If the cells never reach full voltage, the short circuit has less energy to work with. The problem, it was not a fix. It was risk reduction. The defective cells were still in the vehicles. By July 2021, General Motors had confirmed fires in 2 vehicles that had already received the software remedy. The patch had not stopped the chain reaction, it had only delayed it. On July 14, 2021, General Motors sent a bulletin to all Chevrolet dealers. The language was direct. Owners of 2017 through 2019 Bolt EVs were advised to park their vehicles outdoors immediately after charging, not to leave them charging overnight, and, in subsequent NHTSA guidance, to park at least 50 feet away from other vehicles or structures. This was not a safety measure. It was a liability acknowledgement. General Motors was telling customers that the recall fix they had already received was insufficient, that the risk of fire was still present, and that the best available guidance was, keep the car away from anything that could burn. On August 20th, 2021, 9 months after the first recall, General Motors did what it should have done from the beginning. Every Chevrolet Bolt EV ever manufactured was recalled, all 141,000 vehicles. Model years 2017 through 2022, every Bolt EUV, the complete production run. The remedy this time was not software. General Motors committed to replacing the battery modules, the physical cells, in every vehicle, at no cost to owners. The cost to General Motors, approximately $1.8 billion in total recall charges across all 3 recall actions. Bolt production at the Orion assembly plant in Michigan was paused while the company worked through its parts supply. General Motors said it would pursue reimbursement from LG. In October 2021, LG agreed to cover roughly $2 billion in recall-related costs, accepting financial responsibility for the manufacturing defects that originated in its facilities. The class action litigation that followed produced a document record of what General Motors knew and when. 8 separate class action lawsuits filed in federal courts across the United States in late 2020 and early 2021 were consolidated into a single case in the Eastern District of Michigan. The consolidated complaint alleged that General Motors had internal analysis of the fires and knew the software remedy was insufficient before it was deployed. The complaint used specific language. General Motors operated with a cynical, business-as-usual approach. That phrase appeared in filings authored by plaintiff's counsel, not judicial opinion, but it was never formally disputed by General Motors in its response. The core allegation: General Motors chose the software patch over a hardware replacement in November 2020 because a full battery replacement recall for every Bolt ever made would have cost more than $1 billion. At a moment when the Bolt was General Motors' primary EV product, a settlement was eventually reached. General Motors and LG established a $150 million relief fund for Bolt owners who had been inconvenienced by the recall restrictions. Owners who had the diagnostic software installed received up to $1,400. 141,000 vehicles recalled. 3 separate recall actions, $1.8 billion. 9 months between the first recall and the decision to replace the hardware. Full stop. Here is the question no settlement can answer. If General Motors had replaced the battery modules in November 2020, instead of issuing a software patch that reduced the risk without removing it, how many of those fires would not have happened? 2 vehicles burned after the software fix was already installed. General Motors knew the fix was incomplete. The documents suggest they understood the limitation before the first recall letter was mailed. The Bolt is back in production. New batteries, new platform. General Motors says the issue is resolved, and it probably is. But the playbook, software patch first, hardware fix when the fires continue, that playbook is still available. It worked out. Financially, General Motors recovered the costs. The Bolt survived. The brand survived. So did GM know the first fix was incomplete? The answer is in what happened next. 2 Bolts burned after the software remedy was already installed. The defective cells were still inside the cars. The patch reduced the risk. It did not remove it. So the question isn't whether this specific defect is gone. The question is what a manufacturer does when the cheap fix doesn't hold. Now, you know the answer. This channel exists because these stories don't end when the headlines do. The Bolt recall was processed. The settlement was paid. LG covered the bill. General Motors moved on, and the 2 vehicles that burned after the software fix was already installed. They're a footnote in a court filing. Subscribe to Auto Underworld. Every week, we go after the stories the industry doesn't want to tell. The next one is already in production. You don't want to miss it. What they hide, we uncover.